The kingdom was warned, but they didn't listen. Velmoria stood as a beacon of light, until the shadows returned. A forgotten power, buried for centuries, has awakened, and now the land is crumbling. Betrayals run deep. Darkness spreads. And at the center of it all stands Kael, a warrior who never asked for this fight. But fate doesn't care what he wants. With time running out and the enemy growing stronger, Kael must make an impossible choice: embrace the darkness, or die fighting the storm. Velmoria's fate is sealed, unless he changes it. Chapter 1: The Thief and the Amulet. The city of Eldorath never slept. Beneath its towering spires and ancient stone bridges, the streets pulsed with life, merchants shouting their wares, drunken nobles stumbling from lavish feasts, and in the shadows, men like Kael Draven moved unseen. Kael crouched atop a slanted rooftop, his cloak billowing in the cold night wind. Below, the bustling market row gleamed under lantern light, its stalls still open despite the late hour. He had spent years perfecting his craft: silent steps, quick hands, and an instinct for knowing which pockets carried the heaviest purses. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't after gold. His target was a relic, a small, unassuming amulet kept in a vault beneath the Silver Serpent, one of the wealthiest merchant houses in the city. The job had come from an anonymous benefactor, someone willing to pay a small fortune for the trinket. Kael never asked questions, especially when the price was high. With practiced ease, he scaled down the wall of a nearby building, his boots landing silently in a narrow alley. The Silver Serpent loomed ahead, its stone facade adorned with intricate carvings of dragons and serpents. Guards stood at the entrance, clad in polished breastplates, their halberds gleaming under the moonlight. Kael smirked. Amateurs. Inside the vault. Slipping past the main guards had been almost too easy. A few well-placed distractions, firecrackers set off in the nearby wine cellar, and the fools had abandoned their posts to investigate. Now, Kael crept through the merchant's lavish halls, his fingers brushing against golden candelabras and silk curtains as he moved. He found the vault door in the lower levels, a massive steel construct with an intricate locking mechanism. Most thieves would have turned back. Kael, however, had spent the last decade learning every trick of the trade. He retrieved a small vial from his satchel, dripping a thin stream of liquid frost into the keyhole. Within seconds, the metal cracked under the sudden chill. One firm strike with his dagger, and the lock shattered. Click. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber lined with chests and velvet-lined pedestals. Kael ignored the piles of gold and jewel-encrusted goblets. He wasn't here for treasure. There, at the center of the room, lay his prize, a silver amulet resting on a black velvet cloth. It was simple in design, save for the strange sigils etched along its surface. As soon as Kael touched it, a sudden shock coursed through his body. Images flashed through his mind. A great hall engulfed in flames. A king on his knees, blood pooling beneath him. A dark-robed figure standing at the throne, laughing. And then, a name whispered in his head. Kael Draven. The visions vanished. Kael stumbled back, his breathing ragged. His hands trembled as he looked down at the amulet, its sigils now faintly glowing. "What in the abyss is this thing?" he muttered. Before he could think further, a shout rang out behind him. "Intruder!" Kael spun, his heart hammering. The guards had found him. No time to think. No time to question. He ran. Chapter 2: The Hunt Begins. Kael's pulse pounded as he sprinted through the winding alleys of Eldorath. The stolen amulet burned against his chest beneath his tunic, its eerie glow fading as he ran. Behind him, the shouts of the guards echoed through the narrow streets. "Stop the thief! He has the artifact! Damn it!" This was supposed to be an easy job. Kael veered left, vaulting over a wooden cart, sending fruit rolling into the street. A merchant cursed, shaking his fist, but Kael had no time for apologies. He needed to disappear, fast. He darted into a side passage, pressing his back against the damp stone wall. Heavy boots thundered past the entrance, the guards rushing in the opposite direction. Good. They hadn't seen him slip away. Taking a moment to catch his breath, Kael pulled the amulet from beneath his tunic. The sigils had dimmed, but the memory of the vision still burned in his mind. A burning palace. A dying king. A name whispered in the void. Kael Draven. He had been an orphan for as long as he could remember, raised by thieves and cutthroats in the backstreets of Eldorath. There was no royal blood in his veins, only the struggle to survive. And yet, something about the amulet felt familiar. He didn't have time to ponder. A sharp whistle cut through the night air, more guards. They were searching every alley, every rooftop. Staying in the city was suicide. He had to get out. A dangerous deal. There was only one way to escape Eldorath unnoticed. The Red Harbor. The docks were controlled by the Ravenspire Syndicate, a ruthless smuggling ring that moved contraband through the kingdom. If you had the right connections, and enough coin, they could get you anywhere. Kael knew exactly who to find. He slipped through the shadows toward a run-down tavern on the edge of the harbor, the Black Gull. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale ale and damp wood. Mercenaries, sailors, and criminals filled the tables, speaking in hushed tones. At a corner booth sat Varek, a broad-shouldered smuggler with a scar running down his cheek. He looked up as Kael approached, his eyes narrowing. "Draven," Varek muttered. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Kael said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I need passage out of the city. Tonight." Varek snorted. "Trouble with the law again?" "You could say that." Kael pulled a small pouch from his belt and tossed it onto the table. The clink of gold made Varek's eyebrows rise. He opened the pouch, inspecting the coins. Then, he looked back at Kael. "Double this, and I'll consider it." Kael clenched his jaw. He didn't have more. But he did have the amulet. He hesitated, then slowly pulled it from beneath his tunic. "This is worth more than gold," he said, placing it on the table. "Take me out of the city, and it's yours." Varek studied the amulet, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached for it. A dagger slammed into the wood between them. "That," a voice said, "doesn't belong to you." Kael turned sharply. Standing by the table was a woman in a dark cloak, her hood partially pulled back to reveal piercing emerald-green eyes. Her posture was poised, deadly. Varek scowled. "Who the hell are you?" The woman's gaze didn't leave Kael. "Someone who just saved your life." At that moment, the doors to the tavern burst open. Guards flooded in, swords drawn. "By order of the king, seize the thief." Kael swore. Varek grabbed the gold and vanished into the crowd. The woman yanked Kael to his feet. "If you want to live," she hissed, "follow me." He didn't hesitate. Together, they ran. Chapter 3, The Mage in Exile. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and smoke as Kael and the mysterious woman sprinted through the maze of Eldorath's backstreets. The guards were right behind them, their shouts echoing against the stone walls. "Who are you?" Kael panted as they ran. "No time," the woman snapped. "Keep moving." She led him through a hidden passage behind a collapsed building, its walls crumbling with age. As soon as they ducked inside, she grabbed a handful of dust from her belt pouch and threw it behind them. A thick black mist erupted, swallowing the passage in darkness. Kael coughed, eyes burning. "What the hell was that?" "Shadow dust," she whispered. "It'll blind them for a minute. Now shut up and follow me." She moved quickly, leading him through the ruins and out into the open countryside. The city walls loomed behind them, torches flickering as the guards searched in vain. Only when they were far enough away did she finally stop, turning to face him. "You're Kael Draven," she said, her voice calm but certain. Kael tensed. "You know my name. That's never a good sign." She ignored his sarcasm and pulled back her hood, revealing sharp, elegant features and striking emerald green eyes. Her dark hair was braided, streaked with silver despite her youthful appearance. "My name is Seraphina Vale," she said. "I am the last of Velmoria's royal mages. And you, Kael, are the kingdom's lost heir." Kael blinked. Then, he burst out laughing. "That's a good one," he said, shaking his head. "You almost had me there." Seraphina didn't smile. "You don't believe me?" Kael scoffed. "Let's see. I grew up in the gutters, stealing just to eat. Pretty sure I would have noticed if I had a throne somewhere." Seraphina sighed. "The amulet you stole, it belonged to King Aldrich. It carries the magic of the royal bloodline, and it recognized you. That's why you saw those visions." Kael frowned. He hadn't told her about the visions. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Seraphina took a slow step closer. "Do you feel it, Kael? A pull in your blood? A power that's been buried inside you?" Kael opened his mouth to protest, but then he realized something. Since the moment he'd touched the amulet, he had felt different. Stronger. More aware. It was as if something inside him had woken up. Still, he shook his head. "Even if what you're saying is true, why would the king abandon his own son?" Seraphina's expression darkened. "Because he had no choice." She gestured toward a nearby grove of trees, where a small campfire flickered. "Sit. There's much you don't know." Kael hesitated. He should have run. He should have left this madness behind. But something deep inside whispered that this was the truth. So, against his better judgment, he sat. The truth of the lost heir. "The kingdom of Velmoria was once a land of magic," Seraphina began, staring into the fire. "The royal family was blessed with the ability to wield it, and with that power, they protected the realm. But 20 years ago, something changed. Lord Malagar, King Aldrich's most trusted advisor, began whispering about a prophecy. He claimed that if magic continued to thrive, it would bring about Velmoria's destruction." Kael listened in silence, the flames casting long shadows over Seraphina's face. King Aldrich was hesitant, but Malagar's influence grew. Soon, magic was outlawed. The royal mages were hunted. And those of us who survived, were forced into hiding. Seraphina met Kael's gaze. But the worst betrayal came when Malagar turned on the royal family itself. Kael's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Seraphina's voice was quiet, almost mournful. "Malagar convinced the king that his own firstborn child was a threat. He claimed that if the child lived, Velmoria would fall. In his desperation, the king made an unthinkable decision. He ordered his own son to be taken away. Hidden. Forgotten." Kael's heart pounded. "You were that child, Kael." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Kael shook his head slowly. "No. That's not possible." Seraphina watched him carefully. "The amulet proves it. And your blood knows it." Kael's hands curled into fists. "Even if that were true, why now? Why would the amulet only react to me tonight?" Seraphina's expression turned grave. "Because King Aldrich is dying. And Malagar is preparing to seize the throne." She leaned closer, her eyes burning with urgency. "The kingdom is on the edge of war. If you do not return and take your rightful place, Malagar will rule, and Velmoria will fall." Kael swallowed hard. This was too much. Too fast. He had spent his whole life running, surviving, stealing. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a thief. But deep inside, something stirred. A whisper of destiny. And for the first time in his life, Kael wasn't sure if he wanted to run anymore. Chapter 4, Shadows in the Dark. The fire crackled in the still night air, but Kael barely felt its warmth. King Aldrich is dying. Malagar is seizing the throne. And I'm, the lost heir. It was madness. Kael stared at the amulet in his palm, its sigils pulsing with faint golden light. A piece of him wanted to believe Seraphina's story. But another, more familiar part, the part that had survived on the streets, told him this was a trap. He had spent his entire life trusting no one. Why start now? Seraphina sat across from him, her emerald eyes sharp as ever. You're still doubting me, she said, not unkindly. Kael scoffed. You expect me to believe I'm some long-lost prince? That the king tossed me into the streets like garbage because of some prophecy? Yes. Kael flinched at the bluntness of her answer. You weren't abandoned out of hatred, Kael, Seraphina continued. Your father was desperate. He thought he was protecting you. He had no idea Malagar would use his fear to destroy the kingdom from within. Kael looked away. It didn't matter. King or not, the only thing he knew how to do was survive. He wasn't some hero in a legend. He was just a thief with nowhere left to run. I should go, he muttered, rising to his feet. Seraphina sighed. Where? Back to Eldorath? You won't make it past the gates. Kael frowned. What are you talking about? She gestured toward the road behind them. Malagar knows who you are now. His spies are everywhere. The moment you set foot in a city, you'll be hunted. There is no going back to your old life. Kael's blood ran cold. She wasn't lying. He had seen Malagar's influence firsthand, how his enforcers operated in the shadows, how his informants traded whispers for coin. He clenched his fists. Then what am I supposed to do? Seraphina stood, stepping toward him. Come with me. We need to reach the sanctum of the forgotten before Malagar does. Kael raised an eyebrow. The what? It's an ancient temple, hidden deep in the Duskwind forest, she explained. It holds the last remnants of Velmoria's true magic, and the only weapon powerful enough to stop Malagar. Kael folded his arms. And let me guess, only I can wield it. Seraphina smirked. You're catching on. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. This is insane. But then he thought of the guards, the way they had chased him through Eldorath. The way Malagar's men had almost captured him. If Seraphina was right, he had nowhere left to go. And if she was wrong? He'd be dead soon enough anyway. Kael sighed. Fine. Let's go. The assassin in the trees. The Duskwind forest loomed before them, a vast expanse of twisted trees and shifting mist. It was said that no traveler who entered without a guide ever returned. As they moved through the undergrowth, Kael felt the weight of the amulet against his chest. He glanced at Seraphina. So, what exactly is this weapon we're looking for? She hesitated. It's complicated. Kael raised an eyebrow. You don't know, do you? I know it exists, she said defensively. And I know it was hidden in the sanctum centuries ago, protected by the last of the royal mages. That's reassuring. They walked in silence for a while. The forest was eerily quiet, the air thick with something Kael couldn't quite name. Then, suddenly, a twig snapped. Kael's hand flew to his dagger. We're not alone. Seraphina nodded, already murmuring an incantation under her breath. A faint blue light shimmered at her fingertips. Then, a whistle through the air. Kael barely had time to react before an arrow buried itself into the tree beside him. Move! Seraphina shouted. They dived behind a fallen log as more arrows rained down. Kael scanned the trees. His heart pounded. Where? Then, he saw it. A shadow shifting between the branches. Fast. Precise. An assassin. Before Kael could react, a dark figure leaped from the trees, landing soundlessly before them. She was cloaked in black, twin daggers gleaming in the moonlight. Her mask covered all but her piercing amber eyes, which studied Kael with cold precision. "Give me the amulet," she ordered, her voice smooth as silk. Kael tightened his grip on his dagger. "Not happening." The assassin tilted her head. "You don't even know what you carry, do you?" Kael exchanged a glance with Seraphina. "I know Malagar wants it," he said. "And that's enough for me to keep it away from him." The assassin exhaled softly. "Foolish." Then she moved. Kael barely had time to raise his blade before she was on him. Her daggers flashed, striking with terrifying speed. He dodged, rolling backward as her blade sliced the air where his throat had been moments before. Seraphina unleashed a blast of blue fire, but the assassin vanished, reappearing behind her in an instant. Kael lunged, aiming for her side, but she twisted at the last second, grabbing his wrist and slamming him into the ground. His vision blurred. Stars exploded behind his eyes. The assassin pressed a dagger to his throat. "Give me the amulet," she whispered, her breath cool against his skin. Kael gritted his teeth. "Go to hell." The assassin's amber eyes flickered with something, amusement. "Brave," she murmured. "But foolish." Then, she hesitated. For the briefest moment, her grip loosened. And Kael, never one to waste an opening, struck. He slammed his knee into her stomach, knocking her off balance. Rolling away, he grabbed his dagger and lunged. But she was already gone. Kael staggered to his feet, chest heaving. Who the hell was that? Seraphina's face was pale. That was Nyx's Shadowbane. Kael frowned. Should I know that name? She's Malagar's top assassin, Seraphina said grimly. The ghost of Velmoria. And if she's after you, then Malagar already knows where we're going. Kael wiped blood from his lip. Great. The road ahead. They didn't stop to rest. They couldn't. With Nyx on their trail, every second counted. As they traveled deeper into the forest, Kael felt the weight of the situation settling in. He had spent his life running from the past. But now, the past was chasing him. And if he didn't reach the sanctum of the Forgotten first, the entire kingdom would burn. Chapter 5, The Lost Heir. The dusk-wind forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The deeper they traveled, the thicker the mist became, wrapping around the trees like ghostly fingers. Every step felt heavier, every breath laced with tension. Kael trudged forward, his grip tightening on the amulet hanging around his neck. Seraphina walked beside him, her expression unreadable. You never said what this weapon actually is, Kael muttered, breaking the silence. Seraphina glanced at him, then back at the path ahead. Because I don't know. Kael scowled. Are you serious? She sighed. I told you, it was hidden in the sanctum of the Forgotten centuries ago by the last of the royal mages. It was designed as a last resort, something powerful enough to stop any threat to the kingdom. But what it is, or how to use it, that knowledge has been lost to time. Kael shook his head. So we're walking straight into the unknown. Seraphina smirked. You're a thief. I thought you liked taking risks. Kael let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, when it involves stealing gold, not fighting assassins and evil sorcerers. Seraphina was about to respond when she suddenly stopped short. Her hand shot up. Wait. Kael froze. What is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. A faint glow of blue energy pulsed from her fingertips before vanishing. Then, she paled. "They're close," she whispered. Kael's pulse quickened. "Who?" Seraphina turned to him, her emerald eyes sharp with urgency. "Malagar's men. And they're not far behind us." Kael cursed under his breath. "How many?" "Too many to fight," she admitted. "We need to move. Now." They broke into a run, weaving through the twisted trees. The mist clung to them like a living thing, muffling their footsteps. Then, a howl split the air. Kael nearly tripped. What the hell was that? Seraphina's face darkened. "Hunters." Kael glanced over his shoulder. Shadowy figures moved through the fog, their eyes glowing like embers. They weren't just soldiers. They were warhounds. Twisted, monstrous creatures bred for one purpose, to track and kill. The chase. "Faster," Seraphina urged. Kael didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted, his heart hammering against his ribs. A deep, guttural growl rumbled behind them. Then, a blur of black fur and fangs lunged out of the mist. Kael barely dodged in time as the warhound's massive jaws snapped inches from his throat. Seraphina threw out her hands. A blast of blue fire erupted, slamming into the beast and sending it flying into the trees. It yelped in pain, but more growls echoed in the distance. "They're surrounding us," Kael panted. Seraphina swore under her breath. "We need to find cover." "There." Kael pointed toward a crumbling ruin just ahead. They made a break for it, leaping over fallen stones and ducking under broken archways. The ruins were ancient, overgrown with vines and half buried in the earth. It was clear they hadn't been touched for centuries. Kael and Seraphina ducked inside what looked like the remains of an old temple. The ceiling had collapsed in places, and shattered pillars lay strewn across the floor. Seraphina knelt, pressing her palm against the ground. A faint ripple of energy spread outward. She exhaled. "Good. This place is warded. They won't be able to track us in here." Kael collapsed against a wall, catching his breath. "Great. Now what?" Seraphina didn't answer. Her gaze had landed on something in the center of the ruin. Kael followed her eyes, and froze. A statue stood before them, half buried in ivy and time-worn stone. It depicted a man in ornate armor, a sword in one hand and an amulet in the other. Kael's blood ran cold. The amulet looked exactly like the one around his neck. Seraphina approached the statue slowly, brushing away the vines. "By the gods!" Kael swallowed hard. "Who is that?" Seraphina turned to him, her voice almost reverent. "That is King Aldrich I. The founder of Velmoria." Kael's mind reeled. "That's not possible. He lived centuries ago." Seraphina nodded. "And yet, this statue holds the same amulet you carry." She stepped back, glancing at Kael with something between awe and realization. "You were never just some lost prince, Kael. You are part of something much older." Kael stared at the statue, his heart pounding. For the first time, he truly felt it. A connection. A pull in his blood, ancient and unshakable. Something deep inside him whispered that he was standing at the edge of something far greater than himself. And there was no turning back now. Chapter 6, The Forgotten Prophecy. The ruins were silent except for the distant howls of warhounds fading into the night. Kael stood frozen before the statue of King Aldrich I, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like an iron chain. The amulet in the statue's hand matched the one hanging around Kael's neck, identical in every detail. Seraphina traced her fingers along the ancient carvings at the statue's base. "This temple must have been built centuries ago," she murmured. "A forgotten shrine to Velmoria's first king. It's no coincidence that we found it now." Kael clenched his fists. This doesn't prove anything. Serafina shot him a look. You're still in denial. Kael turned away. Even if what you're saying is true, if I really am the lost heir, what does it change? Malagar has already taken the throne. An army of assassins and warhounds are hunting me. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. Serafina exhaled, her voice softer now. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. But you need to accept the truth, Kael. The kingdom needs you. Kael scoffed. The kingdom has never needed me. And I sure as hell never needed it. Serafina stepped closer. Maybe not. But fate doesn't care what we want. It only cares about what must be done. Kael said nothing. He wasn't ready to accept this yet. Not after a lifetime of being no one. The hidden chamber. As Kael turned, something glowed in the corner of his vision. The amulet. A faint golden light pulsed from its surface, synchronized with the one held by the statue. Then, the ground beneath them rumbled. Serafina tensed. What's happening? Kael barely had time to respond before the floor beneath the statue shifted, revealing a spiraling staircase leading deep underground. Serafina's eyes widened. A hidden passage. Kael stared down into the abyss. A strange pull tugged at his chest, as if the amulet itself was urging him forward. This was meant for you, Serafina said. Kael swallowed hard. That doesn't make me feel any better. Still, he took a cautious step forward. Then another. Serafina followed. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls lined with faded murals depicting battles, kings, and magic long forgotten. Kael ran his fingers along the images. One, in particular, caught his eye. It showed a young warrior holding an amulet, standing against a dark figure wreathed in shadows. The warrior's face was blurred with time, but the amulet was unmistakable. Kael's throat went dry. This is me. Serafina stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the mural. No. This was painted centuries ago. This isn't you, Kael. She turned to him, her gaze sharp. This is a prophecy. The lost words of Velmoria. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a vast underground hall. Torches flared to life, casting a golden glow over the chamber. In the center, an altar stood, covered in dust but still radiating power. Kael stepped closer, his pulse quickening. Resting on the altar was a stone tablet, its surface covered in ancient script. Serafina gasped. The lost words of Velmoria. Kael frowned. You can read this? Serafina hesitated. Only some of it. This is the language of the old mages, long before Malagar's corruption. But I recognize one phrase. She ran her fingers over the words, whispering them aloud. When the last heir awakens, the Shadow King shall rise. Kael's breath caught. Shadow King. You think that means Malagar? Serafina shook her head. No. Malagar is powerful, but he's no king. This speaks of something far worse. Kael's stomach twisted. Worse than Malagar? Serafina's voice was barely a whisper. The true enemy. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber. The torches flickered violently. The air grew heavy, charged with unseen energy. Then, a voice. Low. Ancient. Whispering from the shadows. The heir has awakened. Kael's blood ran cold. The murals lining the walls shifted, the painted figures moving as if alive. Dark shapes spread across the images, shadows consuming the warriors, the cities, the light itself. The prophecy was coming true. Serafina's eyes widened in horror. Kael, we need to leave. Now. But Kael couldn't move. Because deep in his chest, the amulet burned. And a single, terrifying thought gripped his mind. Whatever was sealed away in this chamber, had just woken up. Chapter 7, Awakening the Darkness. The air crackled with a strange, otherworldly energy. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled, and the shadows that had once been still began to stir. Seraphina backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "Kael, do you feel that?" Kael nodded, but his body felt like it was made of stone, rooted to the spot. The amulet hanging from his neck burned hotter now, almost painfully so. It was as though the world itself was shifting around him, bending to the force stirring in the deep places of the earth. Seraphina reached out, her voice urgent. "We need to leave, now." But Kael couldn't move. His gaze was fixed on the altar before him, where the stone tablet lay, its surface now glowing with an eerie light. The script had shifted, and new words appeared before his eyes, pulsing in time with the amulet's glow. The heir must choose. The key lies within. Kael's breath hitched. The heir must choose. He turned to Seraphina, his voice hoarse. "Do you understand any of this?" She shook her head, her face pale. "No. It's not, this isn't right. This is ancient magic. Forbidden magic." Kael reached for the stone tablet, drawn to it as if by some unseen force. His fingers brushed against the cold surface, and in that moment, the ground split open. A roar, deep, guttural, and unearthly, rippled through the chamber, shaking the very foundations of the ruins. Something was waking. Seraphina screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the thunderous tremor that surged through the air. The shadows gathered like dark clouds, swirling around Kael, wrapping him in a suffocating cloak of darkness. A figure appeared, shrouded in the deepest black. Its shape was humanoid, but its edges seemed to melt into the shadows like a nightmare come to life. It stood tall, its presence overwhelming. It spoke, its voice not coming from its mouth, but from within Kael's own mind. "The heir is found. The key has awoken. But the choice remains." Kael tried to speak, but his voice was caught in his throat. The shadows pressed against him, suffocating him. The amulet around his neck pulsed with a painful radiance, as if fighting against the darkness. Seraphina shouted again, rushing forward to grab Kael's arm. "Kael! Snap out of it!" The figure's voice came again, this time colder, more commanding. "The heir is weak. The key is unworthy." Kael felt his strength drain, the shadows pressing down on him like an invisible weight. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled. But something inside him, something deep and ancient, flickered. The voice of the king echoed in his mind. "You carry the legacy of the first king. You are the only one who can wield it." Kael gritted his teeth and raised his head. The amulet burned even hotter, searing into his skin, and for a moment, he felt as though his very soul was being torn apart. But then, a surge of power. Kael's hands shot forward, gripping the stone tablet. The shadows recoiled, hissing in fury, but Kael's grasp tightened, and a blinding light exploded from the amulet, casting the darkness back. The figure screamed, a shrill, unnatural sound, as it dissolved into the air, leaving only a whisper behind. "The choice is not yet made." The choice. The light from the amulet faded slowly, leaving Kael trembling and breathless. The shadows melted away like mist, retreating into the corners of the chamber. Seraphina stood frozen, staring at him with wide eyes. What just happened? Kael looked down at the tablet, his heart racing. The words had shifted again. New letters appeared, glowing faintly in gold. To wield the power, the heir must bind the soul of the kingdom. Only then will the darkness be sealed. Seraphina stepped forward cautiously, her voice hesitant. "Kael, you need to understand. This isn't just some artifact. This is the last of the old magic. The power to seal the darkness was buried because no one could handle it. The power is too much. Kael shook his head, his thoughts clouded with the weight of the decision before him. I have no choice. Seraphina's voice softened, almost pleading. There's always a choice, Kael. You don't have to. Kael interrupted her, his voice firmer now. You don't understand. This isn't just about me anymore. The kingdom needs someone to stop this madness. I can feel it. The power, it's calling to me. I have to choose. Seraphina stepped back, her expression one of deep sorrow. And if you choose wrong, Kael? What happens if you fail? Kael turned to her, meeting her gaze with determination. Then we fight. But we fight on our terms. She nodded, her eyes searching his face. Just remember, there's more at stake than just your life. This power doesn't come without consequences. Kael looked down at the amulet once more, feeling its pull deep within his soul. He could sense the power thrumming inside him, an ancient force waiting to be unleashed. But was he truly ready to wield it? And if he did, what would it cost? The awakening. A wind stirred around them, the first real breeze Kael had felt in the underground chamber. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick with the weight of history. Kael stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on the stone tablet. The glow intensified, spreading out across the chamber in a spiral of energy. Then, a voice, this time a woman's voice, clear and sorrowful. Choose, heir. Choose and end the cycle. The ground rumbled again, and Kael could feel it, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The fate of Velmoria rested on his shoulders. With a final, steadying breath, he closed his eyes, reaching for the power within him. He made his choice. Chapter 8, The Binding Ritual. Kael stood in the center of the underground chamber, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. The stone tablet beneath his hand was warm, its glow intensifying with each passing moment, syncing with the pulsing of the amulet around his neck. Seraphina stood just behind him, watching in tense silence. Her expression was a mixture of awe and fear, her eyes scanning the chamber as though expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. You can still stop, Kael, she said, her voice softer than before. Once you start the ritual, there's no turning back. Kael's heart thundered in his chest, but his resolve did not waver. He had already seen the consequences of inaction, the shadow that stirred, the darkness that was slowly creeping into the land. He had to act. I understand, he said, his voice steady. But this is the only way. The words felt hollow, but Kael pushed the doubt aside. The tablet shimmered under his hand, and he could feel the ancient power within it, pulling him deeper into its grasp. The wind in the chamber shifted, swirling around him, and the shadows flickered to life once again, but this time they seemed to obey his call. Kael could sense the power of the ritual, the magic that had been buried for centuries, waiting for an heir to come and awaken it. Seraphina stepped closer, her voice firm but filled with caution. You need to know what you're about to do. This ritual binds your soul to the kingdom itself. It links your very essence with Velmoria, and with that, you will have the power to control its future. Kael felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of such magic, of the old kings who had bound themselves to the land, becoming more than mere mortals. They had ruled with an iron fist, but at a terrible cost, eventually losing their humanity. But Kael didn't have the luxury of hesitating. The darkness was already in motion. I'm ready, he said, his voice echoing in the chamber. Seraphina nodded grimly. Then begin. The words must be spoken. Kael took a deep breath and lowered his head. His hand traced the ancient script on the tablet, the characters glowing brighter with each word he muttered. As he did, he could feel the amulet around his neck glow fiercely, as though answering the call. I bind my soul to the kingdom of Velmoria. I accept the mantle of power, the burden of the crown. Through the darkness and the light, I shall stand as the king, the ruler, and the protector. The ground beneath him shook violently. The walls of the chamber seemed to bend and stretch as if the very earth were responding to the magic Kael had unleashed. The shadows swirled around him, forming shapes that seemed almost alive, faces, figures, memories from the past. They whispered to him, their voices a low murmur in his mind. The kingdom is your burden now, heir. The throne is yours. The darkness, yours to control. Kael gritted his teeth. The power surged through him, a torrent of magic so potent that it threatened to overwhelm his senses. He felt his body tremble under the weight of it. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he feared that he would be consumed by the power he had just called into being. But then, in a moment of clarity, he pushed forward. I accept the price, he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I will protect Velmoria. As soon as the words left his lips, a blinding light exploded from the tablet, washing over him and filling the entire chamber with brilliance. Kael felt his soul being drawn out, bound to the very land he had sworn to protect. His body was no longer his own, not entirely, he could feel the pulse of Velmoria's heart beating in sync with his own. It was as though the land itself knew him, as though he were part of it, and it part of him. The magic that flowed through him was both a gift and a curse. It was a power that could shape the very world, but it came with a price. His skin burned, his bones creaked, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose himself. But then he stood firm. The land called to him, and he called back. The ritual was complete. The price of power. The light faded, leaving Kael standing at the altar, his breathing ragged. He could feel the power coursing through him, its weight heavy but somehow exhilarating. The amulet still hung around his neck, now glowing softly, as though it were a part of him, tied to his very soul. Serafina rushed to his side, her eyes wide with concern. Kael. Are you all right? He blinked, the world around him coming back into focus. The shadows had retreated, but something felt different. Larger, somehow. He felt an overwhelming sense of connection to everything, the land, the people, and the kingdom itself. I'm fine, he said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and dread. Serafina frowned, eyeing him cautiously. You've done it. But I fear that what you've done has changed you. I can feel the magic in you, Kael. It's alive. It's not like any power I've ever seen. Kael glanced down at his hands. They were trembling, but it wasn't from fear. The power inside him was stirring, alive with energy. It was a power that could save Velmoria, or destroy it. I know, he whispered. But it's the only way. Serafina shook her head. The only way? Kael, you've bound yourself to a cursed fate. The first kings who did this, they were never the same. They lost themselves. They became something else, something darker. Kael's jaw clenched. I can't afford to lose myself, Serafina. Not now. But. He raised a hand to silence her. We don't have time for doubt. The darkness is still out there, and now I have the power to fight it. I'm not going to waste it. Serafina stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with concern. I hope you know what you're doing. Kael looked back at the altar, the stone tablet still glowing faintly beneath his fingers. I have no choice. This power is mine now, and I will use it to protect this kingdom. No matter what the cost. Chapter 9, The Shadow Rising. The dawn had broken, casting the first rays of light over the once dim ruins. Yet the light felt faint, almost distant, unable to pierce the deep sense of unease that clung to the air. Kael could feel it in his bones, the tension that seemed to grip the land, a weight that had not been there before. He stood before the altar, the remnants of the ritual still fresh in his mind. The power that now coursed through him was both a gift and a burden. The shadows from the ritual, the dark figures that had whispered to him, had not left entirely. They lingered, and every so often, Kael could feel their cold presence, as if they were waiting for him to falter. Seraphina was not far behind, her movements deliberate as she approached him. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of worry and disbelief. She had seen the power Kael had invoked, and the consequences of that magic were far from certain. "You're changed," Seraphina said quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I felt it in the ritual. It's like the land itself has," she hesitated, searching for the right word. "Like it has claimed you." Kael turned toward her, his gaze steady but distant. He could still feel the pulse of the land inside him, the overwhelming weight of the kingdom's history, and the terrifying responsibility of holding its fate. It was as though he had become part of something much larger than himself. "The land has chosen me," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both awe and sorrow. "But the darkness still stirs, Seraphina. It's not gone. Not by a long shot." She met his eyes, her own filled with fear. "It's never gone. It's always been there, waiting. But now, with the ritual, it might be waking. And I fear it's more than we can handle." Kael nodded grimly. He had felt the shifting energies of the land, the subtle tremors that had started after the ritual. The balance had shifted. The power within him had stirred the very earth, and in doing so, he had awakened something. "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "But there's no turning back now. We must prepare. The shadow is rising, and we must meet it head-on." A gathering storm. Days passed in a blur of preparation. Kael's connection to the kingdom deepened, and with each passing hour, he could feel the land more clearly, its pain, its grief, its desire for protection. But alongside this connection, the darkness also grew. It was subtle at first, but the signs were unmistakable. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, swirling unnaturally in a sky that had been clear just a few days ago. The winds whispered, carrying with them a coldness that felt like death. The once vibrant forests surrounding the ruins now seemed to sag with a heaviness, their trees twisted, their leaves dark and wilted. Seraphina had been busy rallying the remnants of the kingdom's forces, those who had not been lost to the shadow or driven into hiding. She was the tactician, sharp, focused, and calculating. Kael had seen the way she moved through the camps, organizing people with ease, her confidence unwavering. But even she couldn't ignore the ominous signs. "Something is wrong," Seraphina said, her voice filled with concern as she approached Kael, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The clouds were now thick and heavy, swirling with unnatural speed. "I've sent scouts to the southern borders. They've reported strange creatures moving through the forests. Dark shapes that shouldn't exist." Kael's heart tightened at the words. He had sensed it too, the unsettling feeling that the land itself was turning against them. The magic he had unleashed had stirred the deep places of Velmoria, and something had awoken in the darkness, a force that sought to devour it all. "Have you spoken to the council?" Kael asked. He had made contact with the few remaining leaders of Velmoria, the ones who hadn't fallen to the darkness. But even the strongest among them had felt the shift in power. Seraphina shook her head. "They're divided. Some still believe that the old ways, the ones that banished the darkness in the first place, are the answer. But I fear they're too late. The shadows are moving faster than they can prepare. We need to act now, Kael." Kael clenched his fists, the energy within him rising. The time for waiting was over. The storm that was coming would not be stopped by fear or hesitation. It would take everything Kael had to face what was about to unfold. "I'll make the call," Kael said, his voice resolute. "Gather the forces. We strike first, before the darkness can gain any more ground." Seraphina nodded and turned to issue the orders, her movements swift and confident. Kael stood there for a moment longer, staring into the swirling storm that threatened to swallow them whole. The shadow was coming, and it would not stop until it had claimed everything. The gathering darkness. As the days wore on, the darkness spread like a plague across the land. Villages along the borders of Velmoria fell silent, their people either lost to the shadows or driven into the wilderness. The few who managed to escape spoke of horrors that no living being should endure, monsters, twisted and deformed, born from the very shadows that Kael had unleashed. The people of Velmoria rallied behind Kael, though many remained uneasy. The bloodline of the kings had returned, but with it came the price of a power they could not fully comprehend. There were whispers of what Kael had done, and whether it would truly save them, or doom them all. Serafina worked tirelessly to organize the forces, but even she could feel the growing sense of hopelessness. The darkness wasn't just an external force, it was creeping into the hearts of men. Fear was taking hold, and with it came distrust, division, and desperation. By the time Kael had gathered his army, the storm had grown. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of decay and death. The shadows stretched across the land, growing longer, darker, and stronger with each passing hour. Kael stood at the head of his army, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the storm raged. The land seemed to be crying out, its very essence shaking under the weight of the coming conflict. "This is it," Serafina said, her voice grim as she approached him. "The final battle. We either defeat the darkness now, or it consumes us all." Kael nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. The land, the people, the kingdom, they were all connected through him now. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that the power he had gained came at a terrible price. "I will fight," Kael said, his voice strong. "And I will win. For Velmoria." Chapter 10, The Final Stand. The world was holding its breath. The air crackled with anticipation, thick with the promise of the inevitable clash that was about to unfold. Kael stood at the front of his forces, staring into the storm that continued to swirl on the horizon. The dark clouds were no longer just a distant threat, they were moving faster, closer. The sky was becoming a canvas of swirling black and gray, the storm's unnatural energy feeding into the ground, drawing the very earth into its grasp. Behind him, his army was ready, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Kael could feel in the pit of his stomach. They weren't just fighting against an enemy, they were fighting against the land itself, against the darkness he had helped awaken. The power that had once felt like an answer to the kingdom's suffering now felt like a double-edged sword, its weight more suffocating than liberating. Serafina stood by his side, her face set in grim determination. She had been the steady hand, the one to keep the forces organized and focused in the days leading up to this battle. But even her confidence had begun to crack. The darkness they faced was not like anything they had fought before. "The storm is getting worse," she said quietly, glancing at the growing clouds. "We need to make our move soon, before the darkness can finish swallowing the land." Kael nodded, his jaw tight. The ritual had bound him to Velmoria, but it had also bound him to the darkness that was now rising. He could feel it, like a shadow, always lurking just behind him, waiting for the moment he would falter. "I know," Kael said. "It's time to end this. Once and for all." The march to the heart. The forces of Velmoria began their advance, moving toward the heart of the storm, the place where the shadows seemed to have originated. The land here was desolate, scarred by the presence of the darkness that had been growing in power. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if alive with the fear and anguish of the people who had once walked there. The closer they got, the heavier the air became. The storm raged around them, the winds whipping up in violent gusts. The army moved in formation, shields raised, swords drawn. But Kael knew that their weapons were not enough. This battle was not one of steel, it was one of magic, of wills, and of fates. The distance between them and the epicenter of the storm shortened with every step. They passed ruins that had once been thriving cities, now reduced to rubble by the encroaching shadow. Desperation filled the air as the soldiers of Velmoria whispered prayers and desperate pleas to the ancient gods, but Kael knew the truth, no divine intervention would save them now. At the edge of the ruins, the land seemed to bend, twisting as though it were being torn apart by an unseen force. The air was thick with tension, with the pressure of a battle that was about to begin. Kael paused, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The heart of the storm was ahead, its swirling vortex of darkness just on the edge of their sight. But something else stood before him, a massive, towering figure that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Its body was made of the very shadows that had plagued the land, shifting and writhing as it took form. Seraphina stepped forward, her sword ready. "It's here," she said, her voice low but resolute. "The source of the darkness. The creature we must defeat." Kael's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. But this was no ordinary battle. The shadows that surrounded them were not just an enemy. They were a part of him, a manifestation of the power he had invoked. "I can feel it," Kael said, his voice strained. "This isn't just a creature. This is the very force I unleashed. It's my fault." Seraphina's gaze softened for a moment, but she didn't hesitate. "We fight, Kael. Together. The battle begins." The storm broke open in a violent surge of magic, sending waves of darkness crashing into the ranks of the army. Kael could feel the power of the storm in his blood, its pulse aligning with his own. The land was fighting back, its sorrow and pain feeding into the battle. But as the forces of darkness collided with the defenders of Velmoria, Kael realized that this battle would not be won through strength alone. The shadow creature loomed over them, its enormous form twisting and writhing as it approached. It was a mass of tendrils, its face hidden behind a veil of darkness, but Kael could feel its malice, its hunger. As the creature surged forward, Kael raised his sword, and with a cry, he called upon the power of Velmoria. He felt the land respond to him, its energies rising in his veins as he unleashed a torrent of magic. The ground beneath them trembled as the storm intensified, but Kael's magic was fierce and direct, slashing through the air toward the creature. But the shadow creature was not so easily defeated. It absorbed the magic, its form shifting and twisting, moving faster than Kael could react. The very air around him thickened, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He could feel his connection to the land pulling at him, draining his strength, as though it were drawing energy from him to feed the creature. Seraphina was not far behind. She leaped into the fray, her sword flashing as she cut through the smaller shadows that swarmed around them. Her movements were fluid and quick, but Kael could see that even she was struggling to keep up with the sheer magnitude of the dark force that was threatening to swallow them all. "We need to get to the heart," Seraphina shouted over the din of battle. "It's the only way to stop this." Kael nodded, his heart racing. He could feel the pull of the heart of the storm, its magic as deep and ancient as the land itself. If they could reach it, they might be able to sever the creature's connection to the kingdom. But first, they had to survive the onslaught. A desperate gamble. As the battle raged on, Kael felt the weight of his connection to the kingdom growing heavier. The shadows clung to him, trying to drag him down, trying to claim him as their own. He could feel the darkness rising within him, whispering, tempting him to give in, to embrace it. But Kael fought back, his grip on the power he had chosen growing more desperate. This was his fight, his responsibility. He couldn't let the kingdom fall. He couldn't let Velmoria be consumed by the very darkness that he had awakened. With a final cry, Kael forced the magic within him to explode outward, channeling all of his power toward the heart of the storm. The ground cracked open beneath him, the very earth splitting as his magic surged forward, bright and blinding. The shadow creature howled in pain as the light of Kael's magic collided with its form. For a moment, everything went still. The storm paused. The shadows seemed to hold their breath. And then, Kael felt it. The bond he had formed with Velmoria, the link between his soul and the land, snapped. The creature's form shattered, its body dissolving into the air like smoke, pulled into the light. The darkness around them recoiled, shrinking back into the earth. But Kael was not finished yet. He could feel the storm surging again, the darkness threatening to rise once more. With a final, determined breath, Kael summoned the power of Velmoria itself, one last time. And with that final act, he sealed the storm, trapping the darkness within the heart of the kingdom, far below the surface. The land fell silent, the winds dying down, and the shadows finally retreated.